Right, hello everybody. Hugh Desmond. I'm going to be talking about incentives for replication in connection to the issue of trust. Very quick background, kind of the wider significance of these issues. Just some kind of adverse observation that, of course, this is an extremely multidisciplinary subject area, as already referred to. And one way of kind of making a divide among these different disciplines, thinking about science, is between an economic and an ethical approach, if you can call it that. And so in the first, the scientist is a credit maximizing agent, explicitly modeled as such, responding to often career-related incentives in particular, publication, promotion, and so on. This approach seems to be quite common among philosophers of science, economists, meta-scientists. And I posted one quite well-known paper which kind of illustrates how, the diagnosis and the solution lie in incentive structures, and the challenge lies in ameliorating incentive structures. Now, there's a whole other area in academia that seems to take a more ethical approach, as I call it. Scientist is an ethical agent responding to ideals, capable of acting contrary to incentive structures, at least career-related incentive structures. And so the wider question, which I'm kind of concerned with, is, well, what does this ethical approach really bring to the table? In a certain sense, why can't ethics of science be reduced to a special case of economics of science? These ideals of reliability or honesty, to what extent do they just involve some kind of more complicated incentive structures? And of course, if you were cynical, you might say codes of conduct, like the ALIA code pasted there, is just a form of window dressing in this cold and competitive world of incentive maximization. So what I'm going to focus on is on the issue of trust, and to suggest that this kind of issue of trust is actually one area where the ethical approach seems to be could be doing work that can't be covered by the economics approach. It'll be more of a negative result. I'll start from the observation that there seems to be a lot of trust between scientists, where the intentions are not really in doubt. And in this respect, what's particularly disturbing about sloppy science is it seems to create this picture that science is just, these egotistical scientists putting career over truth or understanding. And I'll focus in particular on replication research as a means to skew the incentive structure to safeguard this type of trust. And so I kind of want to look at that in more detail. To what extent is it realistic? Does it make sense that merely tweaking incentives can safeguard something as trust? So I'll start with a framework, making it a bit more precise, and it'll become progressively more precise. I'll operationalize it. And the conclusion will be some kind of negative conclusion, so that a purely economical approach doesn't seem to account for the default trust that science depends on. So in a sense, it's the first jab at demarcating ethics and economics of science. Okay, my slides are a bit wordy because I'm extracting it from an existing paper, but I put the link there on the PhilSci archives for anybody to consult for references and so on. So what I mean by default trust is this idea that if, like, a scientific colleague makes an assertion and it's clear that this, it's in that colleague's area of specialization, the competence is not really in doubt, well, then the assertion itself is a prima facie justification for believing that assertion. That's kind of a default trust. You trust the assertion of your fellow scientist, of course, unless there's a defeater. So it doesn't mean that you agree with everything your colleague says. You might have an incompatible prior belief, but the issue at stake is you don't really doubt that the intentions are to do good science here. Default trust can be read normatively as an ideal, something to aspire to. What I have in mind is that it's something descriptive, actually, that if you take practices such as peer review or collaboration, that you can't actually make sense of them as justified practices if you don't assume some default trust. So peer review, it's quite well known how peer reviewers can't really pick up on fabricated data. There's some kind of assumption that, in an empirical study, if the basic data is there, that it hasn't been, invented, fabricated. Collaboration, the same. A and B collaborating, there has to be some trust that, B says something for A to build on, that, A can actually believe that B is telling the truth. Credit maximization requires also a little bit of explanation. So this is kind of a norm where it's rational to assert something if it maximizes your expected credit. So, here's a somewhat formal definition. So A must choose to assert some proposition out of a set of possible assertions such that it maximizes expected credit. So it's kind of a very different norm of assertion than you would find traditionally among epistemologists who say, no, we must assert only when there's knowledge or when there's high credence. No, when there's credit maximization, you can actually assert if you don't know something, or even if you have low credence in it, just as long as it maximizes expected credit. So the question here then becomes, in a culture of credit maximization, so where I credit maximize, but that I'm credit maximizing as well, and so on and so on, under what conditions then is trust still justified? Under what conditions, if I make an assertion, can you then take that as prima facie justification for believing that assertion? And in particular then, to what extent can incentivizing replication allow for this trust, right? So that's kind of the idea that's out there a bit at the moment, that all we need to do is incentivize replication, give badges or replication rewards and so on, more funding, so we can skew the risk reward for assertions, so that we punish those who are sloppy, we reward those who are rigorous. And so in the paper, I draw on a prior model, a recent one, kind of an initial model really that connects norms of assertion with credit maximization due to Remco Heesen. And he basically distinguishes between two kind of extreme scenarios: fast and inaccurate publication versus slow, plodding, but very, very rigorous. And the thing is that neither of the two extreme scenarios really maximize credit. If you're very slow and plodding, but extremely rigorous, maybe you publish less, for instance, so your ultimate expected credit is going to be smaller. So there's kind of a happy middle where credit is maximized, sorry. So there's some linear equation there with a lot of parameters that we don't really need to go into. Important here is that there's one independent variable, P, which is the scientist's credence that the publication is accurate. So that's the expectation that if it's subjected to replication research, that it will be successfully replicated. And so I build on this model because it's not really sufficient to kind of capture the issues that are going on with trust in two ways. First, the significance of an assertion, right? Not all studies attract replication research. So kind of if you're a smart credit maximizer and you're not very confident about your assertions, well, you know, it would be best to kind of bury them in some middle of the road journal where nobody will ever pay attention to them. You know, think of the figures who have been caught, like Diederik Stapel and so on. They fabricated, but also published in prestigious journals where, you know, it was almost a matter of time before they were found out. So the significance of the assertion seems to be an important factor to take into consideration in such a model. So novel, important, surprising assertions are likely to gain more attention than trivial or wholly expected assertions. They're more likely to be targeted by replication research, and it seems eminently plausible to assume that, given that there are, you know, 3 million articles published per year now, and it increases by 3% a year. There are many more researchers worldwide, but apparently only 1% publishes more than one article per year. So it seems by all reasonable assumptions that the amount of publications dwarfs the potential for replication research. And in fact, if you look at normative guidance at the moment, and the Netherlands, they actually have some normative guidelines on that, and they explicitly say prioritize only those publications whose confirmation or falsification is likely to have a major impact on scientific knowledge. So there's a lot of selection going on, and it's inevitable. It's a numbers game. Second factor, slightly less obvious than the first, is falsifiability. So this kind of captures how some assertions can be more clearly falsified than others. Because this is an ongoing issue, actually, that replication studies often yield results that neither clearly confirm nor clearly falsify the original study. So the question is very much what to do. So obviously this is no answer, but it's a kind of factor that should be taken into account. In a sense, kind of the rationale is, if you're a smart credit maximizer, what you should do is, if you're not quite sure, you should cover it over and kind of play it safe in light of possible replication research. So here's some references. You know, replication studies don't always give clear answers. The failure to mention limiting assumptions is like one cause of replication studies not actually targeting what was intended. And such limiting assumptions seem to be quite common in studies. So these two extra factors, if you bring them in together with that issue of accuracy, you kind of have like this much more multidimensional decision space where you take into consideration not just the potential accuracy or your own credence in an assertion, but what its significance is, how much attention it'll attract, and to what extent will it actually be falsifiable. So, you know, four kind of key scenarios is: one, it's successfully and conclusively replicated; two, it's conclusively falsified, it fails to replicate. But then additional scenarios, it's neither conclusively replicated nor is conclusively falsified. And finally, it just escapes attention of all replication research. And, you know, the resulting credit maximizing function would have more terms. It's not clear how precisely it would have a neat analytic solution, as Hazen's model does, for those familiar with the paper. So even if you have a simplifying assumption that it's best to have an accurate publication followed by an inconclusive one, followed by just publishing it somewhere where it doesn't attract replication research, and then the lowest expected credit is actually having your study falsified. Even with such a simplifying assumption, it's not clear what an analytic solution would be without further simplifying assumptions. But what I suggest is to think about it instead of terms of actually calculating what strategy maximizes. You can just think of the decision process, instead of calculating it all beforehand, as some kind of search through the assertion space, let's say. And so this would be an example of an assertion strategy. So you begin with considering your maximally significant assertion, and then the first question you ask yourself is, can I get away with it by just asserting it? It's maximally significant, but is it insignificant enough to avoid scrutiny? If not, can it be made reproducible or replicable, which would require further work? If yes, assert. If not, well, can it be made sufficiently unfalsifiable? If yes, assert. And if not, well, then you don't assert, and you then go on to the next in line. Of course, an idealized model, but you go on to the next slightly less significant assertion, and you start over. And if it's just too insignificant, well, then you just stop and you move on to the next project. But so it kind of gives a little bit more of a concrete mental image of what credit maximizing looks like, with slightly more, let's say, realistic factors at play. And I'd like to now revisit the original question: under what conditions is trust justified? And so in such a credit maximizing culture, so scientist B will know that A has followed some kind of, decision tree to maximize credit, and thus that it's possible that A could assert without knowledge or even without having high credence. And so can accurate assertion be sufficiently incentivized, namely by means of, for instance, funding replication research, so that B can defaultly trust A? And with this kind of background, the actual argument is relatively straightforward. So, B has least reason to not trust A if B would know that A has high credence. So that actually, it's a bona fide assertion, and that if it's wrong, it's more of an honest error. But the problem is, in a credit maximizing culture, it's cognitively inaccessible to B whether A actually has a high credence. So needs to look at some other signals, and in a strong replication culture, this is possible. B can look at the significance of the assertion of A and say, okay, it's very significant, so it's likely to attract attention, it's going to be in Nature and so on. Surely there are going to be a couple of labs around the world doing replication research. Okay, I see my time is probably up or close to up, and I'm almost done. Falsifiable, if it's like very clearly formulated with the conditions kind of transparently laid out and so on, that can also be another signal that it's actually falsifiable, the assertion, if targeted by replication research. So these would be kind of signals that would allow B to infer the trustworthiness of A's assertion. However, this is not default trust. This is a kind of form of justified, qualified trust. So my initial gloss was, in a credit maximizing culture, you can trust an assertion if the asserter is unlikely to get away with it, with a false assertion. In slightly more formal terms, this can be formulated that, B is justified in believing the assertion when the assertion is highly significant and clearly falsifiable. So if the first condition is not met, it may never attract replication research. And if the second condition isn't met, it may not even ever be conclusively falsified. So this seems to imply that default trust is not justified in a credit maximizing culture as modeled here, at least. And so this doesn't, of course, imply that it's not important to incentivize replication. Of course it is. Default trust is not something that characterizes all pockets or all aspects of scientific practice. Of course, there are situations where default trust is naive, but without some default trust, peer review becomes impossible. Collaborations are not even worth the name collaboration, because then one collaborator needs to constantly be calculating whether it's in A's interest to kind of get away with sloppy work. So it does suggest a limitation to a purely economic approach to scientific decision-making, in order, at least decisions to assert or not. And even though this would be subject to positive work in the future, it does strongly suggest that the ethics of science may play a role that can't be reduced to the economics of science. Okay, that's it. Thank you.